and thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited for this conversation. So, on the topic of decarbonization, the amount of energy it takes to move, treat, and supply water to people, businesses, and industries is incredibly staggering. And while water has a significant energy demand, the promise of what we can achieve at scale as a community is truly inspiring. There's great work happening, but meaningful decarbonization requires leadership and intention. I'm passionate about elevating the experiences, tools, and thought leadership so we can challenge the status quo and do better, and that's why we're here today. My name is Christina Ahmedpour. As Catherine said, I'm the president of ILO Utilities North America business, and ILO Utilities is a global innovation and technology consultancy. We work with over 400 water utility leaders and thousands of technologists, academic, research, and investors around the world to advance our industry towards a more sustainable and resilient future. We focus on the present challenges of today while looking ahead, and decarbonization is fundamental to our work. And frankly, we have an optimistic viewpoint that we can tackle multiple pronged challenges through creativity, collaboration, and problem solving. So I'm excited to moderate today's session with industry leaders who will share their decarbonization efforts, their perspectives, what they did, how, and why. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to introduce the team I have here with me today. First is Greg Semler. Greg is a serial entrepreneur, and he's committed to making the world a better place. And thanks again to Greg for sponsoring this webinar and making this convening possible. Greg is the CEO and founder of InPipe Energy. InPipe Energy is an emerging technology leader that has a unique energy recovery and pressure management platform for existing infrastructure. So it generates energy and also leverages advanced controls to optimize water distribution networks. InPipe's Hydro XS technology is actually a former ILO Utilities tag vetted technology, and it is engaged with water utilities around the world. In the context of this discussion, this is a solution that has the ability to decarbonize operations while achieving measurable ROI. So in other words, it's a practical tool solution that can bring value without disruption to business usual for water utilities. Next, I'd like to introduce Austin Alexander. She is the Vice President, Sustainability and Social Impact at Xylem. For those that don't know Xylem is a global solution provider that truly has the scale and impact to influence complete change in the sector. Sustainability is core to Xylem's businesses, and their innovation work is directly focused on tackling major sustainability challenges. And this is an effort that Austin leads. Xylem is constantly looking for new technologies, products, processes to mitigate urgent water and climate threats from drought to flooding, sewer overflows, aging infrastructure, and greenhouse gas emission reduction through digital technologies as well as physical products. Next, I'd like to introduce George Hawkins, who hardly requires an introduction. After stepping down as CEO at DC Water, where he served 11 years, George launched an innovation-focused nonprofit enterprise, Moonshot Missions. Moonshot helps water agencies identify and adopt strategies to deliver better outcomes. There's a focus on small to under-resourced communities and water utilities. George brings a wealth of experience from wearing various hats from attorney, professor, general manager, advisor to organizations like Xylem, and notably the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. He's a business owner and a thought leader, and formerly a White House National Infrastructure Advisory Council contributor. And we've seen him at a lot of industry forums. So in all these roles, he has allowed innovation to flourish through asking a lot of questions, the courage to ask a lot of questions, and engaging top down, bottom up, and willing to take risks and frankly try something new. Some of the notable achievements during his tenure at DC Water that I wanted to highlight was the award-winning Green Infrastructure Program, a $500 million investment in clean energy, and deploying new treatment technologies that reduce energy and chemicals while meeting required performance. DC Water issued the nation's first Century Bond, the world's first environmental impact bond, and so on and so forth. So really excited to have George here today as well. Lastly, but definitely not least, is Clifford Chan. Clifford has been the general manager of at East Bay Mud since June 2020, but is no stranger to the innovation world through his efforts and leadership roles at East Bay Mud for over 26 years. He's served in various capacities from operations, maintenance, construction management, etc. As general manager, Clifford oversees the delivery of drinking water to 1.4 million residents and businesses in 20 cities and 15 unincorporated communities in the East Bay in Northern California. He also supports over 740,000 customers through wastewater treatment and operations. Clifford oversees approximately 2,000 employees and a biannual budget of $2.7 billion. East Bay Mud's story is really important to today's conversation. East Bay Mud has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 54% through the generation of solar energy, hydro energy, purchasing renewable energy sources, installing energy efficiency equipment throughout its system, purchasing zero or low emission vehicles, and notably the wastewater energy recovery facility that produces 140% of the energy required for the treatment. So it's energy positive. East Bay Mud is also constructing 2 additional photovoltaic projects to generate an estimated 360,000 kilowatt hours of energy and offset about 80% of its on-site electric load annually. What's really exciting also is that East Bay Mud is in progress of constructing an in-conduit hydroelectric facility to generate 30 kilowatts of energy through the water moving through pipes. 3 years ago, East Bay Mud adopted the goal to be carbon neutral by 2030. So it's easy to get distracted by all the shiny technologies out there. And to me, Clifford exemplifies what it means to think big while also taking calculated risks by bringing sound analysis when exploring how to leverage new technology and solutions. In the end, this truly delivers better results for stakeholders and allows innovation to thrive. So now that I've done all the introductions of the panelists today, you can clearly see that I'm a big fan of all the folks here. They've truly inspired the work that I do, and I'm thrilled to moderate this session and for you all to learn more about their journey and perspective on this very important topic. So I'd like to jump in, and my first question is going to be for you, Clifford. So in regards to East Bay Mud's climate goals, they are impressive, they're aggressive in the grand scheme of some of the goals the water industry has set. For example, most industry standards are 2050 for carbon neutrality. So I'd like to know, how did East Bay Mud come about this aggressive goal of 2030? And in 23 years, you've also reduced your carbon footprint by 54%. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about East Bay Mud's goals, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so first, thank you, Christina. And it's an honor to be on the panel with all of you. And I'll just want one correction. That InPipe in conduit is actually in service today. So it's not even being built. It is in service, generating power. Maybe the first thing I want to say is, we didn't get to this in a day, this goal in a day. I mean, it's a journey. And it's, I think that's something to think about as you in your own utility, just understand this is a journey. And I thought I might just describe what that journey was like for East Bay Mud. So you don't think that you have to set this really aggressive goal and not have to go through and, learn all the lessons that we learned as you get along. It's a good process. Probably about 20 years ago, it started with, that concept of, you can't manage what you don't measure. And the first thing we did was, you have to do an inventory. And we inventoried our scope 1 and 2 emissions just to see where we are. And that initial focus was really, a lot of it was on reducing energy costs, and we put together an energy strategy, and it had 4 components. The first component was, let's just reduce our costs. We may not be able to reduce our energy actual consumption, but let's just reduce the cost by taking advantage of the time of use in a day. Second thing, can we actually reduce our energy use? Third thing, can we diversify our energy supplies? And the fourth is, we have to educate our employees and the communities on what we're doing with respect to energy. And kind of putting it another way, it was about reducing emissions, reducing costs, reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. That was the first step. Now, how do you get people to buy into this, that like this will actually work? Well, people can get very attached to, well, I can understand reducing costs. And I remember the day in our control room, we literally put up an analog clock with the hands on it, and we had in red, this is the peak period. In yellow, this is the part peak period. In green, this is the off peak period. And we told the operators, make sure you don't have any pumps on in the red, really avoid the yellow, and stay in the green. That was all we did, like, as simple as that. No fancy technologies. It was an analog clock with 3 colors on it. And that by itself saved us millions of dollars in pumping costs, because we saved on demand charges and the higher peak energy costs. And we slowly, and we didn't realize this at the time, but we slowly started getting buy-in on this concept of we need this energy strategy. A few years later, we said, you know what, let's set a modest goal. We want to reduce our emissions by 10%. We didn't know whether we could do it or not. Let's do it by 10%. Less than a decade later, we said, you know what, this is working. We can reduce our emissions. We can reduce our costs. Let's set a goal. Let's reduce it by 2040 for our water system and our wastewater system. Let's reduce by 2040. But we made it very clear, we're going to do this, but we will always choose the least cost option. We weren't going to do things that was going to be any more expensive than our normal operations. Then in 2000, we said, you know what, this is working. And the other benefit is, like we're in California, so there's lots of green energy options. But I will say, as I looked around other states, I don't think we're unique in that way. I think those options are there. In 2030, we said, you know what, on the water system, which is the bigger part of our system, we can achieve that goal faster. We can do it by 2030. But we're not sure about the wastewater system. So we actually left our wastewater goal at 2040. Then last year, we said, you know what, we think we could do it for both systems. And so we set the goal for 2030 for both systems. And we made, and this is very important because you need your support of the board. We said, you know what, we're not always going to choose the least cost option. And what we're going to do is say, we're going to project our operations for the year. And if we can buy cheaper power, or if we could buy green power to meet the goal, we're going to do it, even if it's more expensive than the regular power we're going to get. And that was an important goal. And what we said was, the compromise was, but if we miss that target, if we're just a little bit over, we will then choose the least cost option to hit our goal. And so when you look at this, you say, okay, that all sounds good, and we don't want to set an aspirational goal that we don't think is achievable. How are we going to get there? We got like 6 years, 7 years or so to hit that goal. We've achieved a lot, over half of reduction. When you look at our remaining emissions, it's all mostly within pumping. Most of that emissions come from electricity, and it comes from diesel or gasoline use. Well, we can today, if we wanted to, cut 70% of our emissions just by paying for, greener energy at a higher cost. We're not doing that because we're developing our own projects that we think can have a better return on investment. We could hit that goal today, pretty easily. The gasoline portion, I was actually talking to staff. I think last year is the last time we're going to buy a gas-powered passenger or light truck vehicle. We're not going to buy anymore. Medium and heavy duty, that's a whole new world. Not going to talk about that right now. But for the light vehicles and passengers, we can do that. And kind of finally, I'll just kind of end on this. The question is like, why 2030? Why not 2050 or 2040? Well, we had a discussion, and we looked at the Paris Climate Accord, and which said like, these are the limits we want to hit. And the Paris Climate Accord said, to get to that 1.5 ideal 2-degree reduction, you need to be at net zero by 2050. And we recognize, we're not meeting that temperature goal. If we wait till, like, we can't wait till 2050. And so we said, what is an achievable but aggressive goal that can maybe be an example to other utilities to say, you know, it can be done. And we thought 2030 was a realistic, aggressive goal. And that's how we landed on 2030.
Well, thank you, Clifford, for really telling more about your story as well. I think there's a lot there. And a big takeaway, I think, for folks is the fact that your really pragmatic approach of being conscious of costs, not changing big swings in performance, but looking at ways that you can evaluate options within, you know, business as usual, but make better decisions. So that's really exciting. Okay, well, I want to switch over to you, George. A lot of what you've accomplished also ties to the funding and the support to make clean energy investments. One of the notables is that you helped DC Water invest over $500 million in clean energy. Is that you? Do you want to unpack that a little bit more? I'd love to just hear more generally about the investment in clean energy during your tenure at DC Water, as some shared experience for others.
Sure. And like Clifford, I'm delighted to be on this program. Christina, you're a wonderful friend, and what a great person to have as the moderator. I also want to say I'm a big fanboy of Clifford, so I love hearing what they've done. And one of the important parts of this program that all of us will agree on is how we learn from each other. And I always said when I was running DC Water, if it's not illegal, immoral, or unethical, if I see a good idea somewhere else, I'm going to grab it. And that included watching what Clifford was doing at East Bay Mud. That included watching what Andy Cricken was doing at the Camden County Municipal Utility Authority. Anywhere we could find a good idea that then made sense for us, we adopted it. And thank you for the question. And I want to state up front something that I think Clifford touched on. But I have to say, I love the phrase 2050 and net zero, but it also drives me crazy. Because, and I'll just explain why, and it's something that anyone in a utility role will feel, which is 2050 has nothing to do with me. I may not even be alive by then. And it's not within the time frame of any of the decisions I'm making now. So I always worry with a 2050 deadline, it sort of lets us off the hook in a shorter time frame. What Clifford has been able to do at East Bay is to create that sense of urgency and compelling need in a time frame in which he and his board and his ratepayers are able to see success. My other worry, Christina, is the 1.5 degree threshold has already been reached. 2050 is 26 years from now. That seems crazy to me, to solve and respond to a challenge that is hitting us harder and faster, and with water more than any other factor than we ever anticipated. With too much here, too little there, both in the same place, rising sea level, saltwater intrusion, the level and scale of the challenges we as utilities face. By the way, not just in a sense of how our community survives, but for our own costs and operations is much more and much more extensive. So like Clifford, this is an issue that demands, to me, a more immediate response. I'm also having a hard time with net zero because it's a complicated interaction in a treatment plant where you've got emissions from treatment and all the rest. Having said all that, it's still a wonderful phrase that sets aspirations to which we can all agree. And so here's what worked at DC Water, and you'll hear it's very similar to the story that Clifford tells. The reason I came to energy as an issue is I looked at our balance sheet, and almost everything on it was going up. We had a $1 billion nutrient reduction mandated project starting when I arrived. We had a $2.6 billion combined sewer overflow regulatory mandate starting when I arrived. That's $3.6 billion of new costs, all going up. And I was like, that's going to kill us unless we can develop a systematic way to reduce our costs in any way we possibly can. By the way, one of those ways is to do those regulatory mandates in all sorts of new, efficient ways. It's a story for another time. But you look at the balance sheet of any water utility, their top cost is personnel, their next cost is usually debt service, and the third is energy. And so I was like, well, if energy is such a big cost, then in DC Water, it was huge, 30 million plus in energy costs, because Blue Plains, our treatment plant, is so big, and like Clifford, we were doing drinking water pumping all over the city, wastewater pumping from 750 square miles around Washington, D.C. that was where a place that I felt we could save money, and so did our team. But we followed Clifford's playbook. The first thing I did is I hired a full-time energy manager from a power company. Said, we need someone on our staff that understands power markets, understands how this works, is completely attuned to what's out there, including, by the way, incentives and financial benefits that come from the power company when you do these projects. So there's a lot of pots that you can check on. We then did an audit of all of our power use, and then started systematically to working at what we could do in an immediate term. And by the way, almost always our initial selling point was finance, not emissions reduction. There was all that too, but there was good financial outcomes in almost all the steps and projects we were taking. The other comment I'll make on the 500 million, it's actually sort of unfair me or to say that about DC Water, because where we found that we saved the most electricity or clean energy was when we were doing a project that combined purposes. So 500 million is probably the total of what we spent, but it was a combination of what do we have to do at Blue Plains at a mammoth scale is biosolids. It's a gigantic plant. It's treating 370 million gallons of advanced wastewater every single day, which yields 1,200 wet tons. Think about that for a minute. 1,200 tons of sludge every single day. That's 60 full-size tanker trucks rolling in and out of the plant with all those emissions, by the way, every single day. We're like that investment was managing biosolids more clean, having a super class A, which is just a very clean and usable biosolid, while also generating a completely self-sufficient thermal hydrolysis program that had 13 megawatts of clean energy being generated. So it was a combination. Clean energy was a fundamental part there. Last thing I'll say when how did we start building this program is, and I heard Clifford again, everything you need to hear was in Clifford's presentation, which is what was the return on investment? I wasn't focused on low cost. I'm not interested in low cost procurement unless that happens to be the right. I'm interested in low life cycle costs. I will encourage our board to invest more upfront if I know that over time it's going to save us money year after year after year after year. What that required, and if Mark Kim's probably not out here, but our CFO at the time helped us do, is to rejigger our capital investments so that we always were factoring in life cycle costs, operational costs into the decision of how to spend our money. And that often meant spending more money up front, but presenting to the board why that was the best dollars they could spend. Because now year after year, and by the way, that huge investment in thermal hydrolysis and biosolids, it took many years, I'm not even sure we're there yet, DC Water's there yet, of having paid it all back. But it was cash flow positive from year one. So in trucking costs and the electricity we didn't have to buy and the electricity we were generating, that was a cash flow positive outcome. Those are decisions that boards can make, even at big dollars. My last thought is when we're presenting these cases, you never know, there's different audiences that care about different things. So that project reduced our carbon footprint by a third with one project. That was meaningful to some. To others, they didn't care about that, but they absolutely cared about the cash flow positive and savings. To others, they really cared about having clean biosolids. We made all of those cases because it was the sum total of that analysis that actually won the day. But we didn't start there. We started with little solar panels above the lights in our parking lot and just built our way, each step going, that's really cool. What can we do next? And it's amazing how that momentum then took off.
Thank you so much, George. A lot to unpack there. I feel like we're going to go back to the return on investment, a bit of the culture transformation piece. I think what I really just want to pause and acknowledge with some of what you shared was going back to how you can really look at decarbonization through the multiple prong approach. How do you problem solve other challenges that utilities face from the regulatory side of things? Like, so biosolids, to me, that was a really great example that you elevated. and then the creativity of how you analyze and bring more of the financing and other stakeholders together to really evaluate the business case. So thank you for that. We might circle back on some of those themes a bit more. I'd like to pick this ROI piece and go to you, Greg, to hear a little bit more of your perspective as a solution provider. In the years that I've known you, 12 years now, you've been focused on generating power within moving water of pipes. So this is something you've really been passionate about and looking to do. So I think what's interesting about the solution that you're bringing to market is that you're focused on decarbonization through existing infrastructure, and also have evolved your solution to look at pressure management that help anticipate potential leaks and bursts that also deal with other challenges that utilities are interested in prioritizing. I think the question I want to focus on is this ROI piece. And of course, both Clifford and George represent experience in these large utilities. So knowing that we've got dozens and thousands of utilities that are smaller systems, can you talk a little bit about the return on investment and business case for smaller systems to look at in-conduit hydro energy generation?
Sure. Thanks, Christina. That's a great question. Very inspired by Clifford and George's story. But yeah, let's get down to the economics. So energy is a commodity. It's almost always about costs. And so in order to innovate in the space, we really needed to address the cost issues, but also the value proposition around saving water, because that is what's most important to people managing water utilities. So today, there are so many water utilities in the United States. And so what goes into an ROI calculation is fairly complex and very specific to a locality where energy prices drive a lot of this. That being said, there is an enormous amount of capital available from the federal and state governments now that can go into improving the ROI, even for smaller rural utilities. And so we see a lot of interest on the part of rural utilities who want to also sort of share this strong leadership around building a more resilient and sustainable system. So we have a very efficient process for analyzing that, but I would just encourage water utilities of all sizes to take a look at this, because the amount of funding that's available that's not really competitive is unlike we've ever seen it before, that is really focused more on energy and decarbonization than it is on water. So it's a bit of a new paradigm for people in the water industry, but it's a game changer in terms of being able to attract capital and create a new revenue stream that can help reduce the cost of water for ratepayers all over the country.
That's great to hear your perspective on that, Greg. And yeah, this is unprecedented times in terms of funding available for decarbonization, energy efficiency, and savings. And small utilities are great candidates. I think maybe something to unpack as we continue this conversation is really how they access it and get started. But I want to pick off this and go to Austin. Greg's bringing a perspective of energy generation through flowing water in pipes and, of course, leak management. We've had some conversations about how you view the energy footprint around water loss and how we can look at non-revenue water reduction as a way to meet some of these decarbonization goals. Would love to hear more about your perspective and how utilities and other players in the industry can think about that.
Yeah, thank you, Christina, and thank you for hosting us. And to my fellow panelists, this is really wonderful conversation even so far. And so I think in the intro, you talked a little bit about Xylem, and our whole mission is to say, how can we use innovation to solve sustainability and water challenges? And when you think about where do I look for the easiest entry points for innovation, it is a Venn diagram of three things. You need the technology available to solve the problem. You need a problem that is ready to be solved, and you need the willingness and ambition to do that. And where those three things lie is a great opportunity. And non-revenue water is that. It's a no-brainer problem to solve. We all have the ambition and economic will to do it, and the technology exists. And it's a really easy entry point to start addressing emissions related to the energy required to move and treat all this water that ain't going nowhere. And is a nice place to start on that long road to 2030, 2040, 2050, finding those areas like Clifford mentioned that are right in front of you today that can have some pretty big impacts. And I'll call it the nice resources, AWWA's water loss calculator, and they've been working with IWA to do just very simple calculations to estimate non-revenue water, what is the energy associated with that, and therefore emissions associated with those estimates. And you can get a pretty good grasp on GHG emissions you can reduce just by starting to address a problem that you probably want to address anyways.
Maybe Christina, I'll just quickly add to that. I mean, I think for us, it always goes down to like, let's look at the numbers. And when you look at East Bay Mud, that energy is, a lot of it from pumping. And to pump up to the top of our service area is 5,000 kilowatt hours for every million gallons. And, that by itself may be like utterly meaningless to people, but, that is 5 watt hours per gallon. Again, that's probably meaningless to most people. So to make it real, take that 10-minute shower that you're taking. That 10-minute shower is equivalent, if you can remember those incandescent light bulbs that we used to have that hopefully nobody has in their house anymore, but you remember those incandescent light bulbs. That 10-minute shower is the equivalent of a 60-watt light bulb being left on for 2 hours. And when you start making these numbers real, people are like, oh my God, there's a lot of value and energy in this one. And when you look at how much electricity goes into energy use, the California Energy Commission put out a report that talked about how much electricity is used for water purposes, both utility purposes and end use purposes. If you look at, and if you equate that to like exercise, walking, like I'm going to go walk, the amount of electricity California uses in 1 year for water, end use and utility, I would have to start walking. I would have to walk, let's put it this way, for 12.5 billion years. Pretty much, I would have had to start when the universe was born, and that's just for 1 year. And you start putting this in perspective, people start getting it. It's like, oh my God, that's a lot.
Clifford, can you repeat this 12.5 billion again? I want to make sure we hang on and relish in what you just said.
So take all the electricity that California uses for electricity for water purposes, end use, heating the water and for us treating and pumping the water. You take that and you say, look, I don't get, these gigawatt hours mean nothing to me. So let me translate this to something you understand, walking. And to generate the same amount of energy that we use in 1 year, you would have to walk for 12.5 billion years. That's just one person, of course. But again, to put that's pretty much when the universe began. And so part of our goal, when I talk about the strategy and I put the 4 elements, one of them was educate our employees, educate the customers. You have to put in terms that they can understand. Mm-hmm. And they can understand exercise. They can understand light bulbs. You start talking megawatt hours and kilowatt hours and million gallons, people start getting lost. And you have to explain it to them, which gets to, I forget, it was like George or Greg, we're all talking about this cultural shift. How do you get people to understand this? Well, to get people to understand it, you have to make it understandable.
I think communicating in that way is something we all need to challenge ourselves with. I mean, the emotional reaction I had when you said that, Clifford, I know the water footprint, the energy footprint around water for all the ways in which we use it, treat it, is staggering, but those types of numbers and humanizing it really does provoke an emotional response. So even as someone that's in this field, for me to react that way, just speaks volumes to those that you're serving, your board members, your ratepayers, et cetera. So actually, I'm going to build off that a little bit. really about how we get other stakeholders to the table and a bit about this cultural shift. So, George, for you, you highlighted some of the early steps that DC Water took and how you really brought folks to the table. Can you talk a little bit more about this cultural transition and whether you want to lean into folks, your employees, your team members, or those externally, like the board? I think it would be great to hear a little bit more of your strategy and your perspective. I'm sure there's a lot of folks listening in that are really struggling with that. They're really passionate about this, but there's only so far they can go if they don't bring others to the table. So what advice would you give?
Well, thank you, Christina, and what a fantastic discussion we're having. By the way, one of the ways I got to know Xylem, so one of the themes we're hearing is that one of the answers to that question, Christina, is you always pair up these issues with other things, depending on who the audience is. And for example, one of the things, the highest level cost at any utility is their personnel. Well, at Blue Plains, this gigantic facility used to have about 260 people managing it to make the plant go. Today, it's between 60 and 70. Why? The answer is because a lot of the energy saving approaches that we took also saved other things. And you gained all sorts of advantages by doing multiple outcomes. And the reason I mentioned Austin is one of the key ones was pumping. We announced one of Xylem's new pumps at Blue Plains because not only did it use less energy, and it does, it was a variable speed pump that would automatically change how much it pumps, so you never overpumped. What you typically did in the old days, I'm a lawyer, this is what they tell me, is you just set the pump at a certain level that you knew had a margin of safety and you left it there. And often it didn't need that level. Well, this pump automatically moderates itself, so you never pump more than you need, automatic energy savings. But the same technology that allowed you to do that allowed us to do proactive maintenance. So we spent less staff time maintaining the bloody thing. And over time, those multiple benefits meant the staffing at Blue Plains has dropped dramatically and it saved enormous amounts of money. Those are all sorts of audiences. By the way, we still have the same number of staff. We didn't fire anybody. It was just redeploying personnel into other areas. And again, that was something the board was fascinated by. You're able to do all these other things. You haven't had to hire up because of these benefits that you have. Another comment I can't help but make, and I know we'll probably come back to, is small systems. And I actually want to emphasize to those of you on the line who are from smaller systems that in fact, in some respects, energy conservation and carbon capture in smaller systems is a little bit easier. I'm not saying it's easy. None of this is easy. Nothing we do as a utility is easy, because when we had to do biosolids at DC Water, it was 1,200 tons a day we had. There was no small solutions. It was all years of research and analysis. When you run a smaller system, the solutions in parallel are somewhat easier to implement. And if they have these features, they save you immediate cash money on your balance sheet. That's incredibly important for a system that often is strapped for cash. You can pair it with technologies that allow you to use less personnel. That's incredibly important to a utility that may be having challenge with staff. And the third thing we found, thinking about talking to audiences, once we started doing this kind of project and got known for it, we're at Clean Energy, we started getting all sorts of new applicants to come work for us because they saw us differently. So it wasn't just us knowing the stakeholders and they started looking at, I could do clean energy at a sewer plant? And we started getting really great new talent coming in, which is a whole nother category of priority in the public sector world. So you start knocking off all these benefits by these projects. And the last quick story I'll tell you, one of the young, smart engineers that we hired, he brought to us the idea of doing not geothermal, but sewer thermal, which was running HVA system to a new building we were building from the heat that is constant in a sewer. Again, I'm a lawyer. They tell me that that's you either absorb heat or whatever. You can do that in a sewer. He brought it to us. We evaluated it and built a new headquarters on the Anacostia River that uses that for its HVAC system. That's the kind of momentum and culture shift. Everybody's part of it. I also love Clifford's story. For us, it was, I always would tell an audience, have you ever carried a gallon of milk or a gallon of water home and realize it's the heaviest thing you're carrying in your shopping bag? Well, guess what? We move 100 million gallons of drinking water around the city, 100 billion of those every day, and 300 million of those every day of wastewater, which is why we're the biggest power user in the Mid-Atlantic. We got the biggest load, and we're going to save you money. And here's what we're doing. And our customers loved hearing that we were doing things that, oh, yes, it's energy. If you're an environmentalist, it's this. But you know what? Your bill is becoming more affordable because of it. And we can show you that. That was magical. I loved having that story to tell when I was speaking to ratepayers.
Yeah, and I think George is absolutely right there. I mean, we see the same thing. I mean, the more you do this, the more people are creative. I mean, if you think about, what Greg's doing with the InConduit, if people don't have this idea that, I can solve the problem in a different way, you're going to put a regulator in your system and it's going to do it the old fashioned way, right? Create heat, create sound to burn the energy. That's all it's doing. Instead, you're taking that energy, you're taking that head that you have and converting it into energy that you can sell. And you talk about, George, about the people, and I have to admit, I am hopeful with this generation because, and I've told this story to you, Christina, but I was at a university and I was the only water utility at a job fair with a lot of other tech companies, just like people making robots, making point of sale devices, microchips, mostly electrical, mechanical engineers, data scientists. And the person that came up to me, and I still remember her name was Arissa. So if Arissa is out there somewhere, we want to hire you. But Arissa came to me. The very first question she asked me was, what are you doing about sustainability? That was and you know what? We're in the water business. We're in the wastewater business. I had a great answer. I mean, that is our business, right? Hard to talk about that when you're building a point of sale device. But when you're talking about what we do, protecting the environment, protecting public health, like, we have a great story. And so I'm optimistic that this generation is going to be even more creative than we are to come up with more creative solutions to help decarbonize our energy, and so I'm the eternal optimist, and these types of kind of interactions I have just gives me a lot of hope.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Clifford, too, on the back end of what George was sharing. And, part of it is the roles that you all play as industry leaders. There's so many people that are following you, that look up to you. You're setting a pathway, you're normalizing this type of discussion. But also, I think, Clifford, what you're just saying is that some of the cultural shift is coming our way, and we need to be prepared to adapt and welcome it and step up and rise to the occasion to really be a part of that. And, speaking of multiple pronged challenges, a lot of this falls into workforce. How do we attract the best talent that's going to help us with these challenges that are ahead of us? So I think this has all been really helpful to dive into. And, we've talked a lot about decarbonization on the drinking water side. Something that I'm really interested in is on the wastewater side, since, both are flowing essentially 24/7 and give us the potential to really think about how we can leverage that. Austin, so I'd like to ask you a little bit on your perspective on this waste to energy, whether it's food co-digestion or just resource recovery of wastewater. We highlighted earlier that East Bay Mud is essentially producing 140% of power for their wastewater treatment facility. Is this a viable space for the water industry? And should we really seriously be thinking about this beyond just the potable water side? What about the wastewater operations? What are some of those low-hanging fruit or ideas we should really be thinking about?
Yeah, I have very little to add, because you just heard two examples of Clifford and George have actually done the dang thing and put it into work. And so it is viable and it's happening. And it's, to me, one of these, again, no-brainer situations of we've got energy production available to us, a renewable resource that, like you said, it's not going anywhere. And we can really use that. Now, to me, energy recovery, waste energy recovery, is typically, we did a white paper last year, and that was step 4, those kind of big capital intensive projects, but really following essentially what Clifford laid out of start with your baseline, find those easy to target areas that have, the pumping example is perfect. I classify non-revenue water is a great one in there. That's, you're going to get some quick wins. Then start thinking about the short to medium capital investment timeline. What are some smart investments or changes you can make? And then typically at the end, by that point, you've got enough momentum, you've got buy-in, you can start to think about waste to energy and these bigger investments that are really going to take you towards that net zero road map. And so I think it exists, people are doing it, it is there. You've got 2 examples that have been running for years now, and they're all over the country, all over the world. And so it's a no-brainer, but I do caution that oftentimes, especially when wastewater utilities, and they start to think, oh, that means I have to go straight to waste energy recovery. Not necessarily, because that's going to be a really hard jump if you're starting from zero. Start earlier in the process, and then that's a great place to end up once you've got momentum and buy-in.
Okay, thanks so much, Austin. And just to hear about the potential there that we're not leveraging or we could be leveraging. George, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I love the question, and I completely agree with Austin and Clifford and all of us that there's a progression. And waste energy is complicated, hard. There's all sorts of agreements that have to be struck. That's not where you start. That's where you seek to get to. Perhaps that's always on the. But I'll give you another example, and it's from my friend Andy Cricket, who ran the Camden County Municipal Utility Authority. He's one of the principals at Moonshot. And again, it goes to multiple benefits. The thing about, and wastewater, by the way, is for DC water where we devoted most of our energy use. It took far more energy because in wastewater, particularly if you're doing tertiary treatment, which means 3 levels of treatment, you are pumping and treat that same gallon of water dozens of times over a plant with enormous quantities. It's 300 million gallons being pumped over and over and over. So that's where the vast bulk of our energy use was on the wastewater side. But in parallel, there's probably the most opportunities of energy conservation and green energy. And it's often a combination of outcomes. And I'll give you a quick example of one thing in Camden, which most people don't think about, but it's very relevant, particularly for Rust Belt cities, or cities that have systems that were built when a big industry base was there and maybe has shrunk a bit. He ended up, after you do take out sort of the worst stuff at the beginning of the headworks, you do primary. And that is essentially removing pollutants without energy. Stuff floats to the top, other stuff floats to the bottom. They're circular if you fly over them or you see them as you're going. So it's a very low energy way to get pollutants out. And he had more primary tanks than he needed because the Camden region had shrunk from their industrial peak. But in a sort of creative way, they did what they call primary tank optimization. They actually kept all of their primary tanks online and ready to use, more than they needed for the flow in their old flow percentage, so that the flow could sit in them longer because they had more capacity than they needed. And that meant that more pollutants were coming out with less energy, and that the flow that went to the next stage of the treatment process could be reduced more efficiently. There was a project, it took advantage of a resource that was already there. It removed pollutants using less chemicals and less energy, and it made the rest of the process more efficient so that their discharge to the Delaware Bay improved. I was like, that hit everything. And that's why we went up to visit the Camden County Municipal Utility Authority when we were embarking ours, just like we were paying attention to MBUD. There are these examples, and energy touches almost everything you do. And as soon as you start thinking about it that way, it's not too long. It's like, well, how about this? Or look, they're doing that. And the last thing I'll say, because I think it's where we will go, is the big question for all of us is how do we learn about these options so that we can take a benefit of the creativity and ingenuity somewhere else where they've tried things? Like what is Clifford's team's experience with Greg's InPipe technology? That's something we would want to know before we tried, because you have limited dollars and you want to make sure something works. You know that, Christina, you've helped with all of that. particularly for these smaller utilities that do not have a lot of extra personnel or financial resources, that becomes even more important. So the propagation of these ideas is really significant.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely, I was saying, it's definitely a lot of work, especially when resource recovery. So, I mean, I certainly wouldn't recommend this as the first thing you do. And even us, I mean, it's, resource recovery creates other problems. I mean, we used to take chicken blood into our plant because it had high energy waste, but it contributed a lot of nutrients in our discharge to the bay. And so we had to make a decision, which we did, was we're going to stop taking chicken blood. We're going to have a little less energy, but we have this other issue of nutrients to the bay. And so, like, these are the balances when you're running the utility that you're gonna have to make. Is there are challenges, and it's not easy.
Yeah.
And certainly competing interests.
I think that's a really good point, Clifford. And I mean, there's just so many different pockets in which organizations can look at energy efficiency, decarbonization, better, meeting the business as usual regulatory performance requirements, but finding these different opportunities. But it's really about what's feasible, what's low-hanging fruit, the capacity building, what makes sense. And like you said, there's not necessarily a straightforward playbook. It could be a bit complex. And I think the other takeaway, just listening to both Clifford and George here, is that approaching decarbonization in a silo is really not effective. It's really about looking across the organization, whether there's opportunities to optimize existing processes and treatment, using the Camden example, and or just other areas. So that's really helpful to hear those perspectives. I want to take a step back around a business case discussion and evaluating projects. I think this builds off what we're just talking about, of not looking at projects in a silo, not chasing, shiny opportunities because it sounds, exciting, but really dealing with opportunities within your organization. Clifford, you early on talked about the business case. It's not always the cheapest, but your goal is really looking at, how do you look within existing rates to make changes and better deliver on these projects. So I do want to go to you, Clifford, on that, of just how do you evaluate the cost effectiveness of viable projects? What do you look at where decarbonization is an element? And then I'd love to hear from you, Greg and Austin, just a little bit more on the solution developer side. What do you think water utilities need to be looking at that you don't see them looking at in terms of that holistic assessment of the cost effectiveness and return on investment? So Clifford, I'd like to hear from you first on that, and then Austin and Greg, whomever wants to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, you heard a bit from Greg. I mean, there are a lot that goes into this calculation when you look at the cost effectiveness or the return on investment. And I also think it depends on where you are in this journey. I mean, if you're starting out, you may be looking for a strictly, a cash positive endeavor. And I think as George, you need positive cash flow from day one. Like you don't have the wherewithal within your organization to have negative cash flows in year one, hoping for future larger cash flows. We're further along in the journey, where when we look at the cost effectiveness, we're not looking for, especially for these type of projects, a 4-year or 5-year return on investment. These are long-term investments that we can give a little more time for the payback to happen versus a shorter period of time. And without getting into like how we do all the analysis, I mean, I really just want to emphasize it. It really depends on where you are in the journey. And we are further along the journey, and we certainly have more capacity being a large utility to absorb some negative cash flow years for future larger cash flows. But like if you do that analysis and if you have that understanding, you can also get to the point too where you're not just focusing on cost. I mean, we always talk about that triple bottom line. Like not everything is strictly a cost benefit. You do have to look at the people side. You do have to look at the planet side. And there is value that's harder to like, I know the accountants like the numbers, but at some point you do make some value judgments to say, you know what, this has other benefits that I can't necessarily put a number on, but it's going to be important for the organization. But that goes to like where you are in the maturity of your organization too.
Clifford, I just want to follow up on that, because I think that is, how do you quantify that? And if you have a project example where you're quantifying or bringing the people and planet into the overall discussion, how do you put that down on paper and socialize that with folks? Do you have an example you could speak to?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to bigger projects or smaller projects, but however you want to look at this is this. I mean, when we talk about, and I forget who said it earlier, but climate change is going to affect us. We're seeing it today. We're seeing more weather. We're seeing all these impacts. You are going to make investments in resilience projects, water supply projects that cost tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. When you think about the things that we have to deal with the utility, in California, we're an earthquake country. Like, I cannot stop an earthquake from happening. It will happen. And I build my infrastructure to deal with that earthquake that's going to come. Here, we have the opportunity to potentially minimize how big that impact is going to be by doing these particular projects, right? Not just, well, climate change is going to happen, I can't do anything about it, let me build the most resilient water supply or the most resilient levees to deal with the floods. I actually have an opportunity to reduce that impact. I can spend all the money in the world, it's not going to stop the size of the earthquakes when they come. But I can spend a little money and potentially, with a lot of other people who say, you know what, if I do my part, we can have a greater impact and we can actually minimize what that cost will be. That's where I think we're trying to get to, because we can potentially change our future. Other things as a utility, we can't change the future and we just have to adapt to it. And so this is our opportunity.
And the earthquake analogy is a perfect example. I'm knocking on wood right now, because I know
we're in California too.
I know I'm just south of you. So, what I'm getting from what you're sharing too, Clifford, is that storytelling that is needed from leadership to really bring this to the different stakeholders and have them understand. You can't quantify everything down to a number, but really to be holistic. Okay, I want to transition to Greg or Austin, whomever wants to jump in, just building off what Clifford's speaking to and the question of total cost of ownership evaluation or project evaluation. What are some aspects of that overall assessment that you think utilities aren't thinking of that they need to bring into how they evaluate the feasibility of projects? Feel free to answer however you feel is best. So Austin, maybe I'll just turn it over to you. You can start.
Yeah, I'll start quickly and just underscoring, even just from my perspective of running sustainability at Xylem, the other costs, whether that's talent costs, financing costs, et cetera, related to these investments is so critical. So what Clifford was saying was spot on. It is an economic analysis, but also pulling in other pieces. And I think when doing a capital investment or even a replacement investment on equipment, you should be asking your suppliers for the lifetime impact to GHG emissions. And we, as a supplier, should be providing that to you. And so that, yes, there is the operational cost, which any design engineer will ask for, what is the lifetime operational cost, and know how to do that really well. At the same time, ask the question, what is the lifetime GHG emission of running this piece of equipment? What can I include to reduce that may also and should reduce the operational cost? Or what is the difference in GHG emissions if I replace this versus if I repair this piece of equipment? These are simple questions to ask that will drive behavior of your suppliers, AKA the Xylems of the world, when we start receiving those questions. So I think asking those in addition to the same operational costs that you should be asking, what is the CapEx, what is the OpEx associated with this investment or this piece of equipment? Ask those GHG emission questions as well, and put the onus on your suppliers to provide it. We're calculating it, so we need to be providing it anyways.
It's a good challenge.
So we do the same thing. I mean, obviously we're in the energy business and we calculate carbon emissions reduction and provide that to our customers when they're doing a feasibility analysis. But I just want to go back to kind of the theme of this webinar, and is that in water utilities, there's just so many priorities. And I think about Clifford, who took on the GM job just before the pandemic, and then managed through that in a urban city in America that went through all kinds of changes. And all those changes impact water. And so wherever you are managing a water utility, you're impacted by your environment. And going back to what Austin said, which is a Venn diagram. So a lot of technology exists. A lot of water utilities have proven technologies across the board that could be applied for decarbonization. There's a lot of capital available. But what's missing to me is not so much the ROI analysis, because that's really easy to do. It's the leadership. It's the prioritization that this is important, and that my organization, my city, is embracing the need to become more resilient and more sustainable. My customers want us to, and therefore we should establish goals which encourage innovation, cost reduction, carbon emissions reduction, and reward those kinds of employees that can bubble up those projects that make the most sense for the long-term viability of the organization. That's what happens in private businesses, and it seems to me like that's really what's missing, is a commitment on the part of boards, general managers across the country to really focus on this challenge of cooling down the planet so that we don't get overtaken by droughts and fires and floods and all of that. So I think it really comes to me, the missing link is really leadership. And I'm really inspired by what Clifford and George have to say. And just, I think that's really what is missing.
Well, thank you, Greg. So,
yeah.
So my question was really about how to do this analysis that ultimately inspires people, that it makes business sense. And what you're saying is that can be straightforward and accomplished to some extent. It's really about not coming up with the business. And maybe there's still opportunity to hone in on the business analysis side of things, but really it's about leadership. That's the biggest hurdle right now from your perspective, as someone that's been working in this space for over a decade, really trying to get utilities to think about, a practical way to generate energy.
Well, my experience is with most water utilities looking at energy, that the business case is just a reason to say no, because it's the water, it's saving water, making sure water is delivered on a reliable basis, making sure it's high quality water, making sure the pipes don't burst. Those are the places that most all water utilities focus on: aging infrastructure, and how do we keep it going in a pretty constrained capital environment.
Yeah.
So you can make a business case for energy, but it's more than making a business case. It's more like, this is part of our core values to reduce energy costs. And plus energy costs are going up, 15, 20% a year across the country. It's not going to slow down. So it really is important to the affordability of water. And again, I don't think a business case is really the challenge. A business case is easy to do.
Yeah. Well, I really value that point, and it sort of triggers and it challenges leaders in this role that have the power to influence and really think about how they're thinking about these projects. I'd like Clifford and George to weigh in. So Clifford, go ahead, go first, and then George, please chime in afterwards.
Yeah, just quickly, just getting down to just something practical and things I heard Austin and Greg say. So I'm just kind of maybe rephrase it a little bit. As a utility, you're going to do projects. It may not be the project that Greg wants to have happen, but you're going to do a project. And what Austin was saying and what Greg is saying is, well, when you're going to do that project, also think about how you can invest in sustainable technology and sustainable equipment as part of the projects that you're going to do anyway. And what you also heard Greg say earlier is, and if you're going to do a little more to do energy costs, look for those incentives, right? Step two, I'm going to do this project. try to make it sustainable. If I'm going to make it sustainable, let's see if I can make it cheaper and find these incentives. The third thing I think is also critical is when we do the project is expand your time frame. Don't build things for 2 years or 5 years. Like, we are utilities that will be here forever. So you can, it's okay to have a 40-year, 50-year time frame when you look at your planning and your projects. And then to get buy-in, right, is the education piece. You've got to go out in the community and say what you're doing. I'm not just replacing a pipe because it's leaking. I'm not just replacing this pump because it's broken. I'm also doing it for these other, better purposes, sustainable purposes. And finally, and I think you've been hearing from everybody, you're not in this alone. Work with other people, collaborate, right? Learn, steal. Like, George says he steals from me. I steal from George when he was at DC Water. Like, this is kind of a mutual admiration club we're here, really. So, like, we're here stealing from each other. So, like, those, I mean, if I had to, like, boil down to, like, these, like, 5 things we do, like, that's how you would approach a project.
That's great, Clifford. Thank you for that. George, go ahead and chime in.
I'm foot stomping on everything I'm hearing, but I wanted to make a few practical points that are in addition to these decisions, because one of the things that I would add to that calculation of why these kinds of outcomes become very compelling is what happens if you don't. So I partly like what Cliff said. We are now part of solving a problem that I think is the threat to human life on the planet, for God's sake. We all have got to do, I think, what we can in whatever institutions we're part of on that question. It's us. But second, what we worried about at DC Water is what's going to happen if that 1,200 tons, which I won't go into all the details, but it's a Class B bio, what if the regulations change and make that so it's not land applied? The future cost of that was astronomical. The solution helped take that liability out of the equation. So that wasn't necessarily direct cash flow. It took a potential risk off the table. The second risk, if you ask any utility chief or Clifford, what's my greatest fear? Sure, I worry about droughts. Sure, I worry about big storms. I worry about power. I can't solve any problem that DC Water faces without being able to move things and to pump things. And one of the reasons we did and are doing these energy projects is not money. We want power generated on site so that we have our own source that we can power. That's another benefit. That's in place of reducing a liability and risk that, by the way, is catastrophic if it happens. So you start adding up all of these and you start getting all these compelling. The one way I not differ, but I found in most capital budgets, so the folks on the line now who do their own capital budgets, which are utility folks, they're going to usually make project decisions based by priority categories. And the first categories will be regulatory mandate. The second category will be important issues for the board or the mayor. Then water quality, you go down. And I vividly remember at DC Water, when I looked at the final category, it was called Better Business Practices. And we never funded it because we never had any money left by the time we got there. We didn't have enough money for the other ones. I was like, I remember one year I asked their wonderful chief engineer, what's in that category? What is that? And he says, well, those are the projects that would make us more efficient to operate. I'm like, what? You mean those are the ones that would make it so that every year in the future we'd have more money to do everything else? And he was like, yes. And I was like, Mark Kim, who was our CFO, the light bulb went off. And it's just like Clifford said, we decided that is not a category that's separate. That is an ethic that we must view everything else through. So the question of how you be a better business, which is not common in the public sector, very, very good service, is absolutely something we could do. There's nothing stopped us. And as soon as we started thinking that way, it opened up because yes, Greg, there's business, but the culture of looking at those business plans from the right perspective means you have to have that on your mind. And for us, that meant a change to our capital budgeting process. And it yielded all sorts of other good things, some of which were energy, some of which were other chemicals. Chemical costs have gone up 100, 150%, Clifford. Maybe you confirm or not. We're even more. It's almost as much as electricity now. And all of these kinds of projects are what open up when a utility starts thinking that way about everything. And then it's almost off to the races, and you try to keep up with all the projects as they come.
Yeah, it's incredible, George. I mean, your anecdotes are just, again, highlighting the fact that we need to just ask questions as a starting point, and you asking these questions get people thinking and reevaluating the approach, and just really where you landed on rethinking your capital planning approach. I see that as an opportunity, and hear from utilities of, we understand climate isn't a priority. We have in our values, we're prioritizing this, but it's not showing up in how they really look at their capital planning, how risk is quantified in capital planning, how some of the long-term planning is incorporating these unknowns. So I don't know, maybe Clifford, if you wanted to weigh in and maybe how East Bay Mud is thinking about that, but I do see that as a huge opportunity for our industry, just to bring that early stage when we're thinking about the investment that needs to be made. Anyone want to weigh in on that?
Just in terms of looking at the risk?
Yes, like how do you quantify risk in long-term planning, and how are you reevaluating your capital planning approach?
Yeah, I mean, you could pick the area. Water supply is one near and dear to people in California. I mean, you need a reliable water supply. Whether it's because of climate change or anything else, we have hydrologic variability. It exists. If you believe it's going to get worse, then the question is, when you're doing your planning, I mean, it's like your financial portfolio. How much risk are you willing to take, and how much reliability you want? And so, as a utility picking your water supply, do you want to be able to guarantee that under any circumstance I can provide 100% of the water? Probably not. You're going to pick 90%, 85%, 70%. Like, pick the number, right? And then you say, if climate change happens, what if that reliability, I can't meet 70%, right? It's down to 65. What does that extra 5% to get back there cost me? There are things that are out there. I mean, we can do, and we can quantify the cost and look at the reliability. You can start doing these type of evaluations and say, you know what, that's a lot of money. Maybe there's a better way. But the ocean's right next to me, right? I mean, I can guarantee 100% reliability. Nobody's going to be able to afford the water, but I can guarantee 100% reliability. Those are the things that you have to evaluate.
Well, I guess I want to take this as we're getting pretty close to a close with our time today. I want to go back to ratepayer communication and getting board members, council members, elected officials really on board, understanding and supportive. And so, just to go back to some of the things that were discussed before, how can water utilities and leaders such as yourselves that are really wanting to advance projects that are decarbonizing the organizations that we're running, what are ways that we can communicate the value? Are there some aspects that other organizations may not really be thinking of? So I'm just going to pull from what was shared earlier: reliability, resilience. That's all really important, and that's what they care about. Are there any other just sort of nuggets that you want to ensure you leave the audience with today? Just ways that we can communicate the value around decarbonization or climate action. Would love for you to share that. Go ahead, Clifford.
Sure. I'll say this. I mean, our ratepayers don't care if I talk about. I mean, let's put it this way. We did a focus group. And said, what do people care about when they hear about East Bay Mud? They didn't care about the infrastructure projects. They didn't care about resiliency. They cared about three things. The three things that got their attention, that we can then have an entryway to talk about other things. But the three things they care about: one, they wanted to know about our history. Two, they wanted to hear about what we're doing for the future. Three, they cared about the environment. And so we start with, like, when we did our rate case, we started and we built our presentation on those three things. Why was East Bay Mud formed in the first place? What are we doing to protect the environment? And what are we doing, future looking? That got their attention. I went to 24 community meetings when we did our rate hearings, what we call our rate hearings. In the presentation, there was no mention of what the rate increase was going to be. Not one slide that talked about the rate increase. I remember the board president said to me, he said, "Aren't you going to tell them what the rate increase is?" I said, "No, they can ask if they care." And you know what? In the 24, only 2 of them asked, "So what's the rate increase?" Everybody else looked at what we're going to do and saying, "You're doing the right thing." No, 22 of 24 didn't even ask about the rates.
That's incredible. And I wonder if we assume that they care so much about rate increases more, and we make that such a focal point. I really like that there was a focus group to hear about what your ratepayers cared about and to adapt accordingly. So that's a great example. George, what about you? Any thoughts?
I come at it, and I'd love to have Clifford's rate base, because mine was extremely interested in rate levels. And I was facing higher than inflation rate increases. The first year I had 18%, and then it was higher than inflation every single year, substantial rate increases. And there hadn't been rate increases hardly at all for like the longest time. So it was a big deal that people's rates were going up so fast in ways that were meaningful and measurable on their bills. So I completely agree with Clifford that they're interested in those things, but we sort of, and every place is going to be different. So that's one of the messages. You're going to adapt to what works for your audience. Because I did 60 rate, I did, God, endless, Clifford, whenever we're always talking about these things with the people we serve. And I always started with, and this is where energy, carbon capture, and all this is, I want to prove to you in the first part of my presentation that we are doing better for you this year than we did last year. If we replaced 2 fire hydrant for $500 last year, this year it's $250. I want to prove to you in practical terms how we are running a better and more efficient utility now than they were before. And I can prove it by the numbers, because you deserve that from us before I talk about anything that's coming in the future. And my favorite stories were almost always energy based, because they had such a clear story to tell. It has so many different audience points, whether they're interested or not. Some are, some aren't, whether of which piece. Then it led to the second, which is, and now here's what we're doing next, and here's why it matters to you. But in every neighborhood, we'd actually have a map of their neighborhood and say, here's what we're doing in your neighborhood to make life so when you pay this bill, you have a sense of what is going for you. And though at the time, we got every rate increase that we proposed approved. And part of it was that people understood what we were doing, why it mattered to them, and that we were becoming more effective and efficient as a utility on their behalf. And in that story, we had great stories like Clifford of where we came from, who the hell are you, and all the rest. But I think the stories that we can tell with Greg's technology, with Austin's technology, customers, ratepayers love to hear that and to understand you're doing it on their behalf, and that there's stories to be told that they can be proud of their utility and tell their neighbors, yeah, you know this, all that. And that sort of started gaining momentum. And that was fun to watch and see and be part of.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, first, like, tell stories. Don't just have dry slides that, like, tell your story. The other thing I think I'm trying to say is, yeah, the customers are all different. You need to understand your customers. And, how many people have gone through and done a focus group to understand their customers. And I will also say, when those 2 groups asked, like, what is the rate increase? I didn't tell them the percent, because if you tell them the percent, yeah, we had higher than a CPI. What I said was, it's 10 cents a day. And they're like, oh, I don't care anymore. Yeah, I mean, but it was way higher than inflation. But 10 cents a day, they don't care.
I agree. We use percentages so much in the industry, and it creates more alarm than I think we need to. So, 10 cents is negligible. So, all right, Austin, Greg, from the solution provider perspective, you work with so many communities across the US and world. Going back to communicating the value, is there anything that we're missing here? Anything that you'd like to add that you see as working to really influence change within cities, communities, and organizations you support? Greg, go ahead and go first.
Go ahead, Greg.
Sure. I mean, we're seeing an enormous amount of interest in the United States and around the world to decarbonize. And certainly outside the United States, there's much more focus on decarbonization than there is in the United States. but it's growing in the United States, and it's becoming much more important, especially if you're managing the most important resource on the planet, which is water, and it's so energy intensive. So more and more water utilities are looking for solutions, and that's why we wanted to do this webinar, so that we could share these ideas about what are some of the low-hanging fruit, some of the opportunities. But we're definitely seeing an enormous amount of interest. And then again, if you add these incentives that are available, it's really something that every general manager of a water utility should at least look at, because the economics are very compelling. And to the point of the last discussion, it's the kind of thing ratepayers really get excited about. And we don't talk enough about water innovation. And this is something certainly, Christina, you know as much about as anyone. It's so interesting to all of us water people, how water works. And yet water utilities are somewhat reluctant for some reason, which I've never been able to figure out, to talk about it. And, keeping the water flowing is an amazing amount of effort. And so I'm with you, Clifford. Let's tell the customers and the ratepayers what you're up to. I think they love it. They love hearing those stories.
Thanks, Greg. All right, Austin, any perspective on your side?
Yeah, I nothing to add to the valuable conversation so far, but I think the thing that I hope for us all to come off this call and come back to is, wastewater utilities, it estimates make up over 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions, at least. And that's expected to double if we close SDG 6 and provide water and sanitation access to all those people who don't have it today. So we're talking about a pretty hefty portion of all the global greenhouse gas emissions associated with our sector. And we care them because in a lot of cases, that's our equipment being used to run these utilities, and it's for a good purpose. And yet we need to decarbonize that. And to steal from George, a comment he made in our pre-call is, the house is already on fire, and we have to keep grounded in what we're talking about. And there are the tactical pieces, and there's the day-to-day management that has to happen. But if we aren't also communicating back to what problem we're trying to solve here, is that it resonates with many of the people we're serving, whether that's Xylem serving utilities or utilities serving their end users, that we need to keep grounded in that urgency of, this is not a problem that can wait till 2050. It has to start now.
Thank you, Austin, for bringing that back to the surface. And it really is a call to action. I think what we've covered today is really the practicality and how we can think about the solutions and tools and projects we're already working on, and how to bring decarbonization as an element of it, the leadership required, the storytelling that's required. We're getting pretty close to time. So on that note, I want to be able to just, any last remarks from you all that you want to leave the audience with on how they can play a role in decarbonizing water. Clifford, I'll start with you, and really 30 seconds each, just any last thoughts on that you can leave them with.
Well, first, I just want to thank you and thank everyone here. I mean, again, I think if there's anything I want to share is, kind of building on Austin, is you really do have to start now, and it's doable. I mean, it's not that daunting of a task. You just need to put your mind to it.
Fantastic. George.
And I'll be quick. And I just want to say, in a slightly different, how much I appreciate Greg and Austin and you, Christina, because what we need in the folks running utilities is a constant flowering of new ways to do this. So everyone who's on this call, it's not on the utility side, but it's on the vendor or provider or inventor side, God bless you. Because we need to have these ideas coming to us. Christina, you help us evaluate them and learn about them, so that we can make action at the time right now as the house is on fire, because it's absolutely possible. And thank you for making it possible for us.
Thank you so much, George. All right, Greg, any last thoughts?
No, I'm inspired by this webinar. I really learned a lot, and love hearing the stories, and anything I can do or InPipe can do to support the water industry to become more carbon friendly, carbon neutral. We're all about that. So thanks again, Christina. Really appreciate the great moderation.
Thank you, Greg. All right, Austin, any last thoughts for our attendees today that you want to leave them with?
Now we're all in this together. It takes every single one, from technology to utility to design engineer, community members and partners. That's the only way we're going to do this thing. So I really appreciate the diverse perspectives on the call and partnership to achieve this critical goal for all of us.
Thank you. So I'll bring us to a close with some final remarks. I go back to, really how we frame this discussion, which is the water industry is such a consumer of energy. We put out a lot of greenhouse gases, but the potential for us to move the needle, if we come together and really think about practical solutions within the projects that we're already delivering, and how to get our ratepayers energized and boards energized and staff energized, we all have that potential. I am incredibly inspired by everyone here and the leaders that are doing the work, that are leading the way. It is uncomfortable. We didn't even talk about climate change 5 years ago. We weren't using climate change. So the fact that we're here today, I think it just illustrates how important it is to have bold leadership, to really challenge the status quo. And it goes back to problem solving, creativity, and the importance of collaboration. A few things just to really think about is, for all of those that are here, bottom up is really important. You all need to vocalize ideas and what you're looking for, but top down leadership is so key. We talk about how general managers and executives of water utilities are in roles for sometimes decades. So for all of you that are leading organizations, don't underestimate the power and influence you have to change your communities, your organization, and to really make meaningful change. And the sense of urgency is there. We really need to look at that and bring practical solutions, as well as really think big picture and long term. So with that, I just want to thank you all for tuning in. One of the final notes on behalf of AWWA is regarding the time that you get for joining this call, certification, professional hours associated. So just wanted to remind you all about that. There is a survey at the end of this. We would love your feedback. Greg is really committed to keeping this conversation going as a thought leader, and perhaps we'll continue to convene again. So with that, I thank you all for your time and hope you all have a great day.